Hello, good morning. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to today's program, 10 years after Sandy, how far have we come? I'm Ellen Honigstock, the Senior Director of Education at Urban Green Council. Jack, if you can go to the next slide. Urban Green's values are excellence, inclusion, collaboration, and engagement. And we invite you to be mindful of these during the program, both when you're viewing the presentations and asking questions. And now I'd like to turn it over to our CEO, John Mandyke.
Ellen, thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody for joining us today. We're thrilled that you're with us for this great program. You know, this event today is happening, of course, in the shadow of Hurricane Ian, which had devastating impacts, as we know, more than 100 lives lost. Estimates are early that it was a $100 billion event. The scary thing is we're living now in the future, the climate future that was predicted just 10 years ago. Climate events are changing. They're coming faster, they're stronger, they're in different forms, and they're everywhere. I was struck by just some recent events. The United Kingdom recorded its highest temperature ever, literally melting highways. 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater. The Yangtze River in China ran dry, leaving shipping stranded and hydropower inactive. And of course, Hurricane Ian just 2 weeks ago. And these are just the headlines of the last 60 days. So these events are here, they're real, they're stronger, they're different, and we have to react to them. And of course, no better example in New York than Ida last year and its impact and its devastation that it left us. All this is to say today's discussion is more important than ever. And I'm thrilled that the panel has joined us to help us look at these really important issues. And I want to introduce today's moderator, who is Cecil Scheid, the Chief Sustainability Officer at NYU, and also the leader of Urban Green's Building Resiliency Task Force in 2012. So Cecil, let me turn it over to you for the rest of the program. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, John. A great intro about how this is not just a memorial, but about how important this is. But let's start with where we were 10 years ago, right? So just about 10 years ago, October 22nd, a tropical wave in the Caribbean started to turn into a tropical storm and then a hurricane. And by the time Sandy made landfall here in New York City, 1 week later, it had come from the south, bringing a storm surge that hit the Rockaways, Breezy Point, Coney Island, Lower Manhattan, and the south shore of Staten Island, mostly. New Yorkers lost their lives that day. You can go to the next slide, Jack. I was a lot luckier. I live in Lower Manhattan. We only lost power. We saw the Con Ed substation go up as it was overtopped. And for days, this was the view from our apartment, right? All of Lower Manhattan dark, except for a couple owners that had local cogens that were able to keep running. We were able to stay in our unit. We had a solar-powered flashlight that I charged on the windowsill during the day, and we could use to get up and down the stairways that were darkened to get in and out of the building. But in a sign of how unprepared we were for a natural disaster, as many people were, when the news came, hey, fill your bathtub with water so you can flush the toilet, we didn't even have a plug for the bathtub. Luckily, my now wife figured out that we could plug the drain with like a Tylenol bottle shoved in there. So we filled up the bathtub with water, and we were able to stay there for several days until we used up the bathtub water, or it slowly drained out around the Tylenol bottle, which turns out is not the best drain plug in the world. And once we were out of water to flush toilets or for other needs, that's when we did have to vacate our building and join the many people for whom climate forced out of their homes. Obviously not nearly as bad for us as it is for many other people, but just an example of how the dislocation of climate change can affect a big city. So in the next days, I biked around the city a lot to see what was going on. Jack, next slide. And this was a photo I took a couple days after out in the Rockaways, right? Our lives were turned upside down. Here's a house in the middle of the road. So within the 2 weeks following Sandy making landfall, Urban Green was asked by then Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and then Council Speaker Christine Quinn to convene a task force to look at how to upgrade the building and the zoning codes to make the city better prepared for future events. Urban Green convened over 200 experts, mostly from in the city, but also from around the country and the world. These include building owners, architects, mechanical engineers, structural engineers, electrical engineers, nonprofits, environmentalists, environmental justice groups, neighborhood groups, anyone who we thought had a window on how to do better. And we weren't just looking at hurricanes. We were going to look at high winds. We were going to look at surface flooding. We were going to look at heat waves and the urban heat island effect. We're looking at tornadoes, anything that could affect New Yorkers in terms of a natural disaster coming up. Our first meeting we convened at City Hall, December 19th, so within 7 weeks after the hurricane. And in less than 8 months, so by June of 2013, this group of over 200 have produced a report to the city. Jack, you could go to the next slide. We looked at how to make buildings stronger. And again, today you'll hear about things like the gates that are being proposed to go across the harbor, right, to block out water. Our mandate on the task force was pretty much the 4 corners of the building, a little bit the trees on the lot or other maybe like impermeable hardscape on the lot, but mostly the walls of the building. There was a parallel initiative by the city to look at that larger sort of flood infrastructure. But so we looked at homes, right? How do you raise equipment and get it above the design flood elevation? How do you have cool roofs to stop the urban heat island effect? Jack, next slide. We looked at large commercial buildings, how to stop sewage from flooding into basements, right? Which we saw a lot in the more recent surface flooding we've gotten from heavy rain, how to have better backup generation to keep buildings online. And for large residential, again, how to keep people able to shelter in place, because a large climate event that hits New York could create tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people displaced from their homes. In a commercial building, the main goal is get people out safely, but in residential, you can have widespread dislocation. An example is water, right? We weren't forced out. I wasn't forced out of my apartment because of lack of power. I was forced out by lack of water. The city has a water supply that can feed, by gravity from the upstate reservoirs to the 5th or 6th floor, but in many buildings, it might be blocked by the pump in the basement of the building, which needs power to run. So put a water fixture where residents can get water without energy. And we were specifically tasked by the mayor and the speaker to look at the overlap between green building and more resilient building, right? What could we do that would help with climate mitigation as well as hazard preparation? And I think the best example of that is how to improve building envelopes to allow people to shelter in place. We were very lucky after Sandy. We had mild weather. Even though we were going into November, it was not too cold. But if that week plus power outage had taken place during a heat wave or a polar vortex, the morbidity or the mortality among New Yorkers would have been much higher. So having building envelopes that can resist heat or hold in heat can allow people to stay in their homes much longer in case of a power outage. So that was one of the key things we looked at. So we did this report in June. The city council and the mayor in their turn acted quickly. Their terms were ending at the end of 2013. And so by December of 2013, Jack, next slide, over half of the 33 proposals that we came up with were signed into law. Some of these were just best practices, but many of them were changes to the building code, the zoning code, or other city rules and regulations that govern buildings. Most of them were things going forward. When you do work, you have to comply with these rules, but some of them were actually retrospective and required owners to retrofit existing buildings that were otherwise in good working order, which, as you know, is a really big ask of real estate and anyone who owns a building to mandate costs and work in the name of disaster preparedness. But we did it. So by the end of the year, next slide, we had these signed into law. Some more were signed into law in the next administration. And so here today, just 10 years later, I'm going to ask probably the most important question post Sandy. In the past 10 years, how did my hair get so gray? No, obviously that's not the most important question. I'm going to ask 3 questions of our panel. Number one, what's better now than it was then? How are we more prepared than we were then, 10 years in? What do we still need to do, right? What were we aware of? But we didn't get all the way and more needs to be done. And then what has changed? What didn't we think of? What are the new things we need to consider as we move forward? So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our lovely panel today. Fiona Cousins, who's a principal at Arup. Rebecca Fishman, who's a senior policy advisor in the city's mayor's office. And Geeta Nandan, who's a principal at Thread Collective, an architect. You can turn on your videos and we'll get you online. Folks can feel free to ask questions in the Q&A throughout, and maybe we'll intersperse some, or maybe we'll take some of the Q&A at the end. We'll see. So thanks so much for joining us, panel. And I'm going to start off with Rebecca. So Rebecca, you're in the mayor's office. You work very closely with many agencies and all across the city. Based upon what you're seeing, do you think we are better prepared now than we would have been, in October 2012?
Thanks for that question, and thank you all for having me today. I'm excited to talk to you all about what we've been kind of doing in the last 10 years post Hurricane Sandy. And I apologize for any background noise. A colleague is speaking next to me, and we're in an open office. So yes, I absolutely believe and agree that things are better now than they were 10 years ago, and the city as a whole is more prepared. We've made significant investments, around 20 billion in investments in our public housing, in residential buyouts and acquisitions, and rebuilds and elevations. We've hardened our infrastructure, our wastewater treatment plants, our utilities. Con Ed has invested $1 billion in their own grid hardening. You described kind of losing power. One way that they have worked to kind of solve that issue and think through future storms is something called grid segmentation. So a huge swath of New York will never go off the grid for as long. We've worked on our coastal infrastructure. So we have two major coastal protection projects in construction right now, both the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project and the big Army Corps project out in the Rockaways on the beach. We have several more coming online in the next few months. We're really looking at the city as a whole. So we're thinking through how we can become more resilient at both an individual and kind of a system-wide scale. And we've kind of partnered with our agencies to learn how to do that. It's kind of going to elementary school, middle school, and high school at the same time and learning how to build this kind of new asset class and infrastructure for New York. And as you kind of mentioned earlier, we're looking at a multi-hazard universe. So we're thinking not only how we can become more resilient to future hurricanes, but how we can be more resilient to big rain events. We're finding that storms and hurricanes are becoming wetter. So we have to be able to absorb and get rid of much larger amounts of water, not just on the coast, but inland as well. There are higher heat days, so we need to think of using low albedo materials. We need to think of planting more trees and creating cool corridors. And then we're also thinking about how the seas are rising. So there are parts in New York right now who see regular tidal flooding, who have to move their cars, who can't go to work, can't go to school, just based on tidal flooding and high moons. I mean, high tides based on moon phases. So we kind of have a multi-hazard threat, and we're really working together with communities, city agencies, and our state and federal partners to make the city more resilient.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. It's a great view from the mayor's office, that sort of overarching view. So Fiona, working at Arup, you work with owners directly and on building projects, directly, large projects here in the city, but across the world. What have you seen change in the past decade, and where we may be a little bit better off?
So when we first had Sandy in New York, it was really the first time that I think that the tri-state area had thought about resilience. It became a very hot topic very, very quickly, and nobody had really addressed it before. And one of the things we found, I think, across the city and across the whole of the tri-state was that actually a lot of people have done thinking about this before, that actually there is a fairly mature resilience literature and a fairly good understanding of what you might do in different cases. We brought in lessons from the Netherlands, we brought in lessons from other parts of the US where people have had hurricanes more frequently. And we also kind of were in, I think, a bit of a state of shock in the city. I think, Cecil, you were saying that we got the Building Resiliency Task Force at the Urban Green Council up and running within 6 weeks of the hurricane itself, which I think sort of really speaks to this idea that everybody was like, oh my goodness, I never wanted to go through this again. What on earth can we do to solve it? And I think that the sort of the energy and the thinking and the information that we brought into the city over the time immediately after the hurricane and some of the things we tried on different projects have taught us lessons that are quite resilient. As in, I didn't mean that in quite the resilient way, but they're quite resilient in terms of they are lessons that we will retain. We have embedded them in the codes, partly through Building Resilience Task Force, but also through other efforts. And we've also embedded it a little bit in our collective memory. I think that though that what was really clear is that the first 5 years were very, very active. Lots and lots of intellectual energy, social energy, political energy poured into resilience and how you might deal with hurricanes and that particular hazard. And it's become much less so. We saw a much smaller reaction to Ida when that came through town. We've seen a much smaller reaction to other hurricanes as they've come through, and that's not because the risk has really gone away. Actually, the risks are increasing, as Rebecca says. Hurricanes are becoming wetter. They're also becoming windier. And those two things together mean that actually we need to think quite hard about what are the things that we want to be resilient to. And then creeping up on us from the other side, and not actually related to hurricane resilience, is we're getting an awful lot more heat waves in the city. And actually that's also something that really speaks to resilience of the electrical grid, resilience of the people, and our buildings in New York are typically not built to have air conditioning. The NYCHA houses typically are not air conditioned. There are lots of places where we have vulnerable people without the ability to deal with the changing climate in the non-hurricane season. So I think this multi-hazard piece is something else that we have learned.
That's great. And I want to say, as someone who's looked around, for apartments here in the East Village in Alphabet City, I've already had real estate agents tell me not to worry about floods, even if it was flooded during Sandy, because they're going to build the East Side coastal, resiliency, so everything will be fine. So at least that message is getting through to some people. So Geeta, you're an architect. You work with homes and home buildings and homeowners. Homes are sometimes overlooked in the New York City conversations because we often focus on that relatively small number of buildings. That's such a large percentage of the building's area, but single family homes and row houses are the most common building typology in the city by number, and lots of people live there. So what have you seen for those smaller buildings in the past 10 years?
Yeah, and just to pick up on this sort of thing that both Fiona talked about and you talked about, is like collective memory, and you talked about like, oh, it's getting into the language of the everyday person. I think what Superstorm Sandy offered us, and specifically the Building Task Force, Resilience Building Task Force, was this like moment to push things into high gear. And I feel like it was a way, and you know, having change happen in the building industry is like, you know, right, you know, turning a ship 180 degrees. And so even if it's taken 10 years, there has been this like, I don't know, it's gotten into the ether, right? It's gotten into the atmosphere, this idea that, you know, the way that buildings were built prior to Sandy, you know, were sort of the old way. And now there is, you know, a different way and a different model of both construction and how we think about sort of like, you know, building practices. But it's, you know, it takes a long time. And I do feel like the policies that were put into place through that task force really helped to like push things and move the wheel a little bit faster. I think that one of the, and you know, moments like that are actually kind of really important. Otherwise we sort of just plod along in our typical way. And it feels like, you know, hopefully we don't, you know, sort of keep doing that, you know, at that pace, and we really pick up the pace, you know, at what's needed, especially in light of what needs to happen in the next 10 or 20 years. I think that one of the most drastic changes for homeowners has been the passage of legislation and the push to electrify buildings. And I do feel like homeowners are taking that very seriously. And while, you know, if you read the media, there's a lot of pushback against that, saying it's challenging, it's expensive, it's, you know, is it really necessary? I actually think it's the easiest thing for homeowners. It's like one of the most tangible ways that they feel like they can participate. You know, replacing a stove, going from gas to electric, pretty easy. You know, adding in a solar canopy to a building that's gone electric to try and achieve a net zero. You know, not easy on every condition, but it's a lighter lift than, you know, sort of renovating and re-insulating everything. And obviously that's where you want to start, you know? And so in a way, it's not necessarily the starting place, but it's a way, it's like the back door to get people to understand, you know, and if you sort of understand that you're electrifying a building, then you might start to really understand like, oh, I need to also insulate the building with that. So it's a back door, but at the same time, like literally like just a couple of media releases that happened around the electrification, and we were getting phone calls like, oh, our project is in mid-design right now. Should we actually be doing this whole electrification thing? Like, you know, and to me now, I don't know, it's been a year and a half. It's an easy ask. It's everybody is sort of on board with it. You know, and there are many parallel processes that need to happen, especially at the homeowner scale and the small scale, that need to happen simultaneous to some of these bigger policy pushes. Like you need dryers that are going to work as heat pumps, right? That are going to, you know, otherwise the rumor gets out, oh, I heard those dryers are horrible, I'm never going to install that, we can't go electric. So you need these other innovations and advancements to happen at the same time. So the passage with the, you know, or the mandate of the tax abatement for solar, you know, having other parallel policies that help support each other and sort of build that network is very important. Not one of these policies can sort of stand on their own.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I think shows how complex the, you know, resiliency plus mitigation piece is, in the sense some people say, well, if you go all electric, you're taking away a certain amount of you know, resiliency, because you don't have that gas as a second fuel. On the other hand, we saw in the Rockaways the fires and people who lost their homes because as the foundations moved and the gas lines were exposed, the natural gas supply caught on fire and the homes burned down. And we saw whole, you know, like city blocks lost to fire, and you're taking that risk away. So there's some give and take. So then in terms of these challenges, Fiona, to be, you know, you were on the task force. Let's take a hard look at things. What are things where more work is, you know, still needed? What are some things that we looked at? And, you know, you yourself mentioned, hey, for the first 5 years, maybe the focus was on, but now, you know, we didn't have a second big flood like that. People don't think about that as much. Like, where do we still need to act on things that we saw at the time? We'll get on to new threats in a minute, but where do we still need to act on things we saw at the time?
So I think that I think there are still things we need to do, right? There's a whole lot of Lower Manhattan that hasn't been protected. There's a whole lot of the south side of all of the, all of Brooklyn and Queens that also it has not noticeably improved in terms of its resilience. And part of that is because a lot of the buildings that we have are existing buildings, and it's incredibly difficult to make things happen in existing buildings because there's no kind of code trigger, there's no DOB review. It's just an existing building and it's just keeping on going. And it's always the cheapest thing to do in the moment, maybe not long term, is to leave it exactly as it is. And so people don't like being persuaded that they need to spend some additional money. So I think that while there have been some sort of systematic and systemic hardenings that have happened of our systems, the electrical grid has improved quite a lot. The electrical grid is also obviously very much in flux as a result of the CLCPA and some of the local law 97 work. We are becoming more and more dependent on renewables. That's largely a good thing, but it creates different challenges for the grid, different ways in which that grid might need to be made resilient. What do you need to be resilient to, and what do you want to happen when the worst happens? Kind of the two key questions in resilience. And those questions are still very much live for the for this. I think so. There are some sort of big picture city things that maybe need to be completed, but I think that one of the other things that we've learned from Sandy or from disasters in general is that there's no point in planning necessarily for the last disaster that happens, because Ida didn't look like Sandy, Ian didn't look like Andrew. That different hurricanes have different appearances in different places. Sandy came with almost no rain, which I think we always forget. Ian came with an enormous amount of rain, even up here, and it created different things that you want to be resilient to. So this key question: what do you want to be resilient to? What are all of those risks that you want to put together? Which of those things, is energy efficiency, passive survivability? I mean, the answer to this question is yes, but energy efficiency and passive survivability both kind of help with extreme heat, as well as helping with the resilience of the grid, as well as helping with the ability for people to shelter in place, and so on and so forth. So it's, in some cases, the piece of work we haven't really done, and it's difficult to do because there are so many actors and so many different boundaries of control, is what are the things that are synergistic? What are the things that we can do that actually help, irrespective of what the disaster is? I think Geeta's thinking about, yes, you should electrify, because actually it solves a number of other things as well. So there are other drivers for doing that. But the thing that then has to happen is that the grid has to be harder, or you have to have a local generator or an alternative, because otherwise you have built yourself in a single point of failure. So I think that discussion and sort of the ability to have the nuances of that discussion, they take quite a lot of background thinking that I think is really hard for people to get their heads around in a sort of soundbite world.
Excellent, thank you. I want to put it back to Geeta. You were also on the task force. What, on the smaller building end, what are you seeing as the loose ends that we should maybe not forget about? Still need a little more help. I'll tell you what, I think there's a chance we're having some technical issues on Geeta's end, so let's come back to her. Move on to Rebecca. You didn't have the joy of being on the task force and doing those 40+ meetings, 3-hour meetings over 6 months. So sorry we missed you. But from your point where you sit in the mayor's office, what's the big picture here? What are things that we might still need to look forward to and do better?
Yeah, no, great question. So I think sorry, we have a very friendly male person. Okay, so what do we need to do? I think we need to do a few different things. I think what Fiona was referencing is we do need to accelerate an implementation of a holistic resiliency program, those places that haven't been protected yet. I think we need to both accelerate our capital project process and our funding process and our regulatory process in order to do so. I think we need a dedicated funding stream to do both small scale multi-hazard resilience planning, and then to also help building owners do those retrofits and do those resiliency and sustainability upgrades that we need. I think right now we're able to offer technical assistance, but I think, having some sort of dedicated funding stream, whether or not that's from the federal government, the state government, or the city government, would be really helpful. We are implementing a pilot program called the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines, where we're upgrading kind of all of our city's infrastructure based on the latest climate hazards. We need to keep doing that. We need to make sure that all of the city's assets are mitigated against all those multi-hazard risks. I think we need to kind of think through what is the new normal here in New York and how we're going to prepare residents and make sure that we're not imperiling their lives and their property. We've set up a program called FloodNet, where we're hoping to install 500 sensors over the next 5 years in flood-prone areas throughout New York City. These sensors, at least in Gowanus during Hurricane Ida, gave around a 20-minute warning between when they first detected water on the street and a flash flood. So that could be time in which folks can either do personal mitigation, they can take valuables out of their basements, or they can evacuate as necessary. And then kind of the last prong of this is kind of thinking through our housing stock. As you all know, basement apartments are throughout New York and some of the most flood-prone areas, and kind of thinking through what the city should be doing through basement apartments. I know there's talk of legalization and that kind of other policy prongs, but we're in a housing crisis as well. And so how can we marry both the hazard mitigation and the housing crisis and kind of think through innovative solutions?
That's great. And, as folks know, every 4 years, the city is required by law to produce a citywide planning document. Under Mayor Bloomberg, it was called Plan YC. Under Mayor de Blasio, it's called 1YC. Obviously, the Adams administration will be coming out with its own version. Is that, an opportunity? And is there ways for people to get involved with their ideas?
Yes. Thank you for that prompt. Absolutely. So we're kind of right in the beginning or mid of that process. We welcome kind of all feedback about strategic initiatives that you think we can take to make our housing stock more resilient. We kind of get input from all different sorts of places, from city agencies, from local leaders and electeds, from community organizations, from experts in the field, and we kind of compile that and put out this plan in April 2023. So would welcome any sort of feedback or thoughts that you all have on what direction the city should be taking.
Great. So everyone take that as a call to arms. You should all email Rebecca with your thoughts. Gita, welcome back. I hope your technical issues are better. So from the home's perspective, what are things that we knew about 10 years ago and worked on that still need work?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with smaller buildings is that they are not afforded the same types of technologies that are at the larger scale. So, and there are a number of reasons, smaller buildings are literally smaller and have, less mechanical space, have less roof space, have, less site often. And so there are just a lot of more constraints, but at the same time, a lot of the methodologies are very similar to what's needed at a larger building scale. So, but, it's the needs are there, but the sort of the infrastructure isn't quite there yet. So, as we are electrifying, and I think Fiona sort of covered this really well already, but the way to make an electric building, net zero is to add on a solar system. But then in order to make it resilient, it really requires some type of battery backup system, right? Or some type of storage system for the energy, or a thermal storage system, but those are not available right now at the smaller base building scale. I mean, they're barely available now at the larger scale. We're doing a couple of resiliency power hubs, and getting FDNY approval has been very, very, very challenging. It's understandable because, lithium ion batteries can be, challenging in small spaces. There are fire conditions that we have to deal with, but the approvals process has been untenable. So right now, those battery backup systems are not there. In addition to sort of looking at floodgate systems, in addition to looking at storm proofing in some types of conditions, the technology is there at the larger scale, but it's not made yet, or it's not, manufactured yet for that smaller scale. And, or, homeowners are not quite motivated to reach the resilience level of, building practices. They may be willing to reach the, net zero or passive house or other types of implementation that literally they can see sort of like dollar returns on, but having this extra sort of level of construction practice that addresses resilience, I don't think it's quite there at the homeowner. Raising houses, raising buildings, those are sort of, I think at the larger scale of, a new construction, even if at the small scale building, those are becoming more standard. But this retrofit practice, I think is one of the key things that needs to start to sort of become possible in terms of the tools that are out there to implement.
Got it. Thank you. So we're getting lots of great questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask my last sort of round of questions of panelists, and then we'll move on to the audience questions. So feel free to, you can upvote those, and you can also add your own questions. Go ahead and do that. So, Fiona sort of touched on this, right? Humans have the tendency to always be fighting the last war, right? So, after 9/11, when we saw what could happen to buildings in terms of fires, there was actually a push to move fuel oil tanks below grade and get them as far down below grade as possible so they'd be protected. When we had coastal flooding on Sandy and people lost their backup generation or just their heat, their boilers, we saw NYCHA had vast amounts of work needed, right, because of saltwater, saltwater intrusion into basements. Okay, maybe that's not such a great idea. So then the law was changed to allow things to be moved back up above the design flood elevation. And again, trying to balance all these multi-hazard risks. So what has changed in the past 10 years? What are the things we really didn't see then that we are starting, that now we do need to think about? And maybe you've touched on this already in some of your previous thoughts, so don't feel you have to reiterate, but if there's something you haven't said, bring it out. Why don't we start with Fiona?
I think one of the things that has changed is we were all quite shocked by Sandy, right? And it was early in the kind of climate change events that we'd started to see. So I think that one of the things that really has changed in the last 10 years is we are seeing much more widespread events of all sorts of different kinds all over the United States. So and the rest of the world. But in 2012, it felt a little bit like an anomaly. It was kind of the tip of the spear of being able to realize what climate change was going to mean for us. And since then, we've had much more regular wildfires in the West. We've had much more heat in New York in the summer. We've had some colder winters because of the polar vortex kind of idea sort of arrived, and that's also all to do with climate change. And we've had a number of things that have been different to how they were before. So I think that the big thing that has changed in the last 10 years is, although I would say in New York everybody was aware of climate change leading up to Sandy, I think that nobody knew at that point just how fast we were going to feel the effects. And I think we are beginning to see those effects. The downside of that is that we still don't really know what they all are. The upside of that is that I think we have become much broader in our ability to look at hazards. We are beginning to say, okay, there's additional wind, there's more humidity, there are longer periods of heat. There may not be more frequent hurricanes, but there will be wetter ones. So we're beginning to say, actually, are the things that are built into the code, it's kind of that have always, with weather data, have always been a historic thing, right? You always look backwards to figure out what the design temperature should be, or the design humidity, or the design wind speed, and the probabilistic recurrences of those. It's the once in 50-year wind is all based on history. In the last 10 years, we have become much better at understanding what those climate models that show us future weather are like, and are beginning to say, okay, the 50-year historic data isn't good enough. The design condition needs to be based around the thing that we're expecting coming into the future.
Yeah, that is really so true, and really speaks to the point about always fighting the last war, but how do we do better and look forward? Of course, the sea does convene a panel of climate experts that actually advises the city and uses the latest science to try to predict forward and build that into models. But there's always that human element of truly getting that, like emotionally. Geeta, how about oh, go ahead.
So it's also true that quite a lot of this is built into what building owners themselves decide that they want to do. So there is sometimes a minimum set, but actually on almost every building I've ever worked on, we have decided by looking at the data what the design temperature should be. The design wind speed a little bit less so because there's some life safety associated with that. But even then, if a client decides or thinks that the code isn't adequate, you can always design for more, and that has quite often happened. So you don't need the code to move to change your design conditions. You need an awareness in the people who are commissioning and working on buildings, and the people who are designing and setting those design conditions. And I would say that is a move that we are beginning to see. We don't need to wait for code for that one. We can actually advocate from within the design community pretty well, and we should. And I would say in most cases are, because it has become so clear that conditions around us are changing.
Moving on to Geeta on the small building front.
So sort of the climate activism over the past 2 or 3 years almost got a little sidelined, unfortunately, in a way because of COVID. And in addition, our buildings have, or at least at the small scale, have been asked to do a lot more, which I think is a pretty different way of thinking about our buildings than it was pre-COVID. And that's, oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My internet is a little unstable here, which is an issue around resilience. But I'm actually in my office, and I have to say, like, with COVID and everybody working from home for the past 2 years, our small buildings have had to all of a sudden become more than just homes. They have had to become offices. They have had to become meeting rooms, conference rooms, multiple people living in small spaces. So with that, the issues around climate adaptation and, resilience that we're trying to sort of build into our structures then gets sort of pushed even further because the uses change, right? And so I think we have to understand that, like, part of resilience is actually just understanding how to achieve flexibility and how humans actually can be fairly resilient and change their environment from an interior perspective fairly quickly. You can set up a desk, you can reorganize your garage to not be a garage anymore and be a playroom, so there are things that we can do, but it's a question of, like, how do we ensure that the resilience of that flexibility is, like, baked into the way that our buildings are designed. So that way this necessary change is able to happen. And with that, this issue of water and flood, that has, I think, really permeated our mind and our lives, especially in New York City, with these various different sort of wet conditions. I actually think it's the heat that we're up against that feels like there's just becoming a much greater awareness of the real sincere dangers around heat. And to me, heat is a very different type of vulnerability than water and flood is, for a whole host of different issues. And I'm not sure that we're quite there yet in understanding the true needs, solutions, and impacts. And I don't even think we've actually really experienced a true heat wave that is as devastating as we've seen in Southeast Asia and other locations. And it's probably coming. And we have to really, really understand what that means for us. Because I actually think heat is harder to deal with, and our buildings are not prepared. And at the same time, insulating our buildings is great. It works for both resilience and heat. And there are some of these construction technologies that we can apply sort of more broadly and across the board. But at the same time, there's going to be a lot of sort of technologies that we're going to really have to deal with. And, I think we're going to have to just address the fact that sometimes we may not be able to function in the same way that we function in a non-heat condition as we do in a heat condition. So to me, there are other temporal conditions that need to start to get addressed that are not necessarily about this sort of physical structure.
I think that's a great point. And I've just seen in the popular press in the past year or two, the concept of wet heat and wet bulb heat, and that humidity and the human body's inability to cool itself, even if the dry bulb temperature, what people think of as the temperature, is not necessarily absurdly high, but at a humid time is when you can really have large amounts of deaths, especially in the vulnerable population, but among anyone. Okay, so Rebecca, before we move on to questions, why don't you sort of close us out on this question about what has changed in the past 10 years?
Sure. I think most importantly, our work is becoming more and more centered around environmental justice. So thinking through those areas in which climate impacts communities more, and because of our historic lack of disinvestment or our investment in road infrastructure and truck infrastructure and industry in residential areas, and how we can kind of help mitigate those challenges for those folks that have suffered disproportionate amount to the rest of communities in New York. So we're really trying to make sure that our investments moving forward are really centered around environmental justice. And kind of the second prong of that is, I think in the last 10 years, our design guidelines and regulatory environment have really significantly shifted. We have the zoning for coastal flood resiliency. We made modifications to the building code Appendix G. We've launched the climate resiliency design guidelines pilot. We already have some kind of private owners who are choosing to use that guidance, even though that's not codified yet in our building code. The Department of City Planning did the special coastal risk districts. So there's some areas in our city where we shouldn't be increasing density because of the risk of kind of daily tidal flooding and sea level rise. And then we've also kind of really made sure that we've done a lot of outreach and education around risk, and that includes flood insurance. So when Sandy hit and when hurricanes hit in other areas, one of the first issues upon recovery is that the fact that a lot of people don't have flood insurance, or that flood insurance is starting to guide the building or building out of neighborhoods. So we're seeing, like in Florida, that there are certain areas now where flood insurance just won't, or any insurers won't practice because of the risk, like barrier islands or certain areas like that. And I think that's going to start guiding our built environment more than necessarily city policy, just because of the way our system works. So those are kind of like the things I think that have changed the most, but then there's like so many smaller things in the way that you all have been talking about how folks are just more fluent in resiliency, more fluent in risk. We've become somewhat of a national leader in doing so, and hope that we can continue to do that and continue to provide models, and then also continue to learn from other places. We have folks visiting from all over the world who are kind of teaching us how to better adapt our infrastructure and our housing stock, because they've already done it. So yeah, I think continuing to learn is our future, but also helping other folks in the United States kind of start their resiliency planning processes as well.
Great. Thank you. So, you spoke about flood insurance, and of course, everyone would, theoretically say that, a human life is priceless, but in the real world, sources of money to make these changes to buildings are really key. So we have several audience questions about funding, right? Either how does the national IRA, like the Inflation Reduction Act, that has a lot of climate mitigation members, does that address resiliency? Any state funding, any subsidies, any city funding? And you touched on a couple things, but any of the panelists, anything else you'd like to say about funding that's available?
I think I'm not going to address funding in particular, but I'm going to talk about one of the complexities of funding, right? So I talked about this a little bit before, and I think that it's an important piece with resilience. So who gets to do what and why is a huge question. So if you own your own house and you want to be resilient, there are things that you can do. You have all of the controls. You may not have the money, but you have all of the controls and you have an ability to do things at your own house. But if your house is threatened because actually the coastal defenses aren't good, suddenly that's not your problem anymore. And there's a question about who pays for that. Should you be doing the things at your house? This is the question that your real estate broker keeps saying, Eastern Coastal Resiliency will take care of you, Cecil, it'll all be fine. But there's this question about whose responsibility is it to do things? And then in theory, that sort of doesn't matter, but in practice, there's limited amount of money and we should do the things that are the most effective. And the things that are most effective happen at different levels through the conversation. So it might be most effective to do some coastal resiliency work in one place, and that will save thousands of homeowners some upgrade work. But in another part of town, it might be that there are only a dozen houses, and actually the best thing to do is to do it at the house or to do it at the building. So I think that this question about funding needs to be sort of fed through a lens, firstly, of sort of environmental justice, but secondly, a boundary of control and value for money. It's like, what is the right way to spend the limited funds that we have in order to make the resilience that we want? It seems pretty clear that a really good place to spend it is on the resilience of the electrical network. And we know, it's sort of obvious that that's the right place to do, and money has been going there because that is clear that affects a vast number of people and is, it happens at a single point of control and actually within a single boundary. I think that this question about funding is a question about who should be doing what, where should that funding be flowing? And I think there's a sort of whole set of questions that sit on top of that is, what are the best value, most effective things that we can be doing? Because that's where the funding should flow. And I'm not sure that the questions in the gap between, is there money here and can I spend it, has actually been answered in a way that makes appropriate use of that funding or even makes that funding flow in the right direction. It's a very difficult policy question. So there's no criticism involved in this. It's just saying, I think this is a really tough nut and I don't know that we have actually really addressed it or solved it.
Any other panelists? Responses?
Yeah, I mean, in relationship to that is that, especially at the small building scale, it is not yet in our spreadsheet what savings of lives and savings of your own sort of resiliency when a disaster does hit. So those numbers are not within the dollars that are spent today, how that impacts you, tomorrow or 5 years from now, and the value on that investment can be actually quite high if you are able to both survive and function, or function at a higher level than if you had been, impacted by whatever condition or hazard we're talking about. So, those are often invisible, and those are immeasurable. And at the same time, I do think that like our development or our construction budget spreadsheets, they really need to change, and they need to be reconceived of in order to be able to take in these hidden values that are often not addressed, and insurance doesn't value those either. Maybe they're starting to at this point. So, there may not be direct funding streams available. And that is just, a hard reality is if the dollars aren't there, the dollars aren't there. So, that's another sort of issue that needs to be determined. I mean, at this point, really, the best funding stream is the solar installations that you can do both at small and large scales. That's where the highest flow of dollars right now. And so in a way, looking at that as a model to understand how can we then increase, funding streams, whether it's through tax benefits or it's through, direct savings. I think that they have to be addressed in order for the policies to get implemented at a faster rate.
Got it.
I'll just quickly say that overall, the IRA, the New York Environmental Bond Act, all these infrastructure monies coming into the city are absolutely ways to fund resiliency and sustainability projects, and we should be taking advantage of that funding. They're flowing through kind of two different ways, both state formula funding, so it'll come through New York State, and New York State kind of prioritizes projects, and then it'll also come through just kind of normal grant making. So One of the programs that we've been working a lot with is the FEMA BRIC program, which is Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant. It's a smaller grant, it's like $50 million or less, but they can be used on a range of risks and are also especially focused on socially vulnerable areas based on the CDC's SVI. So I think the city, the state, and the federal government, are putting in a first round of investment here, and we need to make sure that we're kind of taking advantage of that and thinking through priorities around resiliency and sustainability.
That's great. And I can say from my own experience at NYU, working with funding, let's say from NYSERDA, that things that would have used to been a bread and butter, like energy saving incentive or rebate program. Now they're asking a question in the application: what's the resiliency overlay, or how does this, contribute to building resiliency? And that's a factor maybe that goes into how they weight who gets a grant. And for NYU, it's often been, as you improve building envelopes and you can make equipment smaller, and as you electrify and the equipment gets lighter, you can move things out of the basement and put it on the roof. And instead of having giant fuel oil and heavy boilers in the basement, you've got light heat pumps on the roof. And so that's a very strong resiliency overlay, seeing all the surface flooding that we've been seeing. So we're going to wind up with a lightning round, no more than 30 seconds each for each of you to say one more thing that you'd like people to know. Is there one thing you think that the city needs to do and the mayor and the city council needs to pass to change this? Is there one thing people need to know? Is there one thing we need to get together? I'm trying to collate a bunch of questions here in the Q&A to wrap up. One thing that people need to work together on to really make a change. And again, keep it to about 30 seconds so we can wind up, and I'll let someone self-nominate to go first.
That was a lot of questions, Cecil. It's
Well,
very
you can
difficult to
answer just one of them. These are just ideas.
So I'll get to it in a second.
I think that the local law, can't remember which number it is, requiring green roofs and solar arrays on rooftops is critical and is the right step in the right direction. I'm a little worried that there's going to be a lot of skirting around the requirement. So, just making it a hard, fast, mandate that all roofs must have some resiliency, sustainable function to them, whether it's blue, green, or solar. Just pushing it a little bit harder. Once again, it's these mandates that are really the push and the drive to making change. And so I hope that we can enforce that particular measure, because I do think it will have a really large impact. And once again, it falls though to Fiona's point about existing structures. We really have to figure out how we're going to tackle the existing building stock, and the existing building stock that is not under renovation, proposed to be under renovation, right? Or having any, construction happening. How are we really going to tackle those? That to me is a big issue.
Thank you, Geeta.
So I would say, leaping straight off Geeta's point, I think that the most important thing that everybody on this call can do is really to say, what is it that I can actually do? So if you're a building and you don't have a plan, if you're a building and you aren't about to be renovated, what are the things that you are at risk from? And what do you want to happen when that happens? Make yourself a resilience plan. Even if it takes you a long time to execute, at least have thought through the issues, because one of the things that we know is that preparedness helps. And if you are prepared, even if you're just mentally prepared, you might have put a go bag together that you didn't previously have, or you might have decided to do something actually that works for the fabric of your building. And so I would say that actually you are your own best resource in terms of resilience. And therefore, the thing that I would recommend is that you think about what you want to happen when something goes wrong, whatever that might be, and make sure that you are somewhat ready for it or have a plan for getting to that point.
Amazing, Fiona. Thank you. And Rebecca, bring us home.
Look at all of our new zoning and design guidelines. I know some of the stuff isn't codified yet, and we're still working through pilots, but the more folks get involved, the more folks start using our guidelines, the more we can learn lessons and kind of make sure that we're doing the right thing. I think we've worked really hard to try and change the status quo of building here, but we want your feedback and your input based on what you're seeing on the ground.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca, Gita, and Fiona. Thanks to everyone who's working to make New York and New Yorkers safer every day. And thanks to Urban Green for this great event. And I'm going to turn things back to Ellen.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Thank you to our speakers. Jack, if you'll put up the slide with our upcoming events, we have a lot of things coming up. These are just 3 of them. We have a member reception on the 19th, a tour of the Casa Pasiva in Bushwick on the 20th, and Local Law 97 unpacking the new proposed rules on November 1st. And we have a lot more, so please check the website. Thank you also to our outreach partners. This is a way we're spreading the word, and we're able to partner with other terrific organizations. And thank you mostly to our speakers and to all of you for joining us for this program.